The ripples began as a tremor that astropaths could not name, a pressure in the skull like a prayer answered by something that had never learned the language of souls. In the bridge sanctum of the Imperial cruiser Oath of Relentless Light, choir serfs bled from the corners of their eyes, while the navigator clutched his third eye and whispered that the warp had gone silent, not still, silent, as if a cathedral full of ghosts had inhaled in the same moment. Cogitator banks spat nonsense strings. Auspex halos returned purity where corruption was expected. And the Geller field sang a single note that made the teeth of every voidsman ache. Captain Leora Val kept one gauntleted hand on the arm of her throne and did not sit, because captains of the Imperium stand when reality misbehaves, and said in a voice the crew would remember in their prayers, "Report." The Sensorium adept tried to swallow fear and failed. Unknown intrusion, real space breach without empiric signature, magnitude minor, vector non-geodesic. And then the main hololith obeyed her order to magnify. The stars bent into a tight cluster of cold fire, and there, in the perfect vacuum outside the armored viewport, drifted a man who did not belong to any archive of species known or proscribed. Bare scalp pale against void shine, a yellow bodysuit that looked like a joke in a galaxy that had killed all jokes, white cape folding and unfolding as if there were wind where no wind could live. Every catechism she knew told Val that this could not be. The Book of Void Discipline told her that a human body in naked space becomes tea, estimony and frost in less than a prayer. Yet the intruder blinked, turned, raised a hand with the casual politeness of a neighbor leaning over a fence. "Open Vox," she said, and the comms officer obeyed with hands that shook despite augmetic steadiness. There was no return ping, no latency drift, only the absence of distance as the figure disappeared between frames, and the klaxons changed from warning to violation as the ship's spirit howled intrusion, main hangar, main hangar. They found him standing between sacred landing runes, ringed by scions with raised hellguns, by tech priests already arguing in Binharik about containment fields and abeyance schema, by arrested servitors awaiting a command that had not yet been written. And the man looked around with mild interest that insulted the gravity of everything and said in a voice that did not echo, "Hey, is this Earth? Megos hexam vortine, cognomen faultless sum," lifted 3 mechadendrites and fed the intruder's silhouette into every litany of identification. The returns were profane in their simplicity. No warp resonance, no subdermal ferrite, no gene tailoring scars, an oxygen debt that refused to exist, a body so ordinary that it overloaded the idea of ordinary. You stand upon an engine of the Omnissiah in service to the God-Emperor of mankind. Identify species, origin, and intent, the Magos intoned, and the stranger scratched his cheek as though trapped between aisles at a grocery stall and said, "I'm Saitama, human, just a hero for fun." The phrase made no sense when spoken into that hangar with its incense and oil and the frist. Looming geometry of thunderhawks asleep on their chains, it made less sense when a dozen machine spirits returned the same absence of anomaly that had already unstrung the choir. It made the most dangerous sense of all in the mind of the Inquisitor, who had been standing without introduction inside the shadow of a bulkhead, where the light refused him out of habit. Inquisitor Severin Malchior of the Ordo Xenos, who did not waste his breath on theatrics as he stepped forward and let the hooded weight of his office enter the room like frost. He watched Saitama the way a scholar watches a fever chart for numbers that declare a plague. "You are human," he said, and Saitama nodded. "From a place you call Earth, which is not the cradle of our species," and Saitama shrugged. "Everything looks different. I might have taken a wrong turn. It happens." Malchior's mind was a ledger, and it began its 3 columns. 1. Xenos in perfect camouflage. 2. A warp construct in perfect denial. 3. Unknown category. A new sin that did not fit in the old reliquaries. And while his inner calculus wrote and struck through and wrote again, the Vox shrieked with the sound of a planet remembering it is prey. Val's strategium bloomed with hololithic wounds. The hive world beneath them was named Meridiana Secundus, and it was a living engine of duty. Its towers higher than storms, its underdeeps rotten with forgotten prayers. And now, its level numbers went dark in ascending order. The way a drowning man disappears finger by finger, reports roared up the orbital tether in overlapping terror. Arbites precinct, house fallen, manufactorums gone to black dust. Vox relay choir cut apart mid-psalm. Picked feeds full of crude glyphs that meant hunger spelled in teeth, orcs in number. The kind of number that makes arithmetic into theology, Malchior said quietly. Armsmen hold. The subject remains contained until I say otherwise. And Saitama tilted his head toward the distant sirens piping through the bones of the ship. So there is a monster problem, and the Inquisitor, still measuring, still counting the ways this could become an extinction, said, "Your concern is not required. You will be examined and categorized before you are judged." And the man in yellow looked briefly apologetic in the way of someone who has already decided to ignore an instruction. "I get bored if I sit too long." The hangar door bulkheads were adamantium layered in dogma. The void shield lines were fresh with fresh prayers. The ship's interior plan had killed men who had tried to learn it without permission, and Saitama walked through all of that, as if walking through a curtain his grandmother had sewn, leaving behind a ring of shocked professionals who did not know where to point their weapons. Malchior did not shout pursuit. Malchior deployed eyes. Servitor cherubs rose like iron pigeons, ink-black dataflies scattered from a censored reliquary, and his vox to the governor's palace below was a thin blade slipped between ribs. "This is Malchior. Inform your council that an anomaly has manifested inside the Imperium's jurisdiction, and that your orc infestation has just become a secondary concern to the existence of that anomaly." On the surface, Governor Halix Rodal watched icons die on a table carved from petrified wood and wanted to be the kind of man legends write down. Instead, he was only dutiful, only frightened. He asked for the guard and was told 3 days. He asked for the fleet and was told none. He asked the cardinal if this was a test, and the cardinal assured him that all pain is a test. The underhive boiled. Fungus seeds that had slept in damp ferrocrete remembered what their dreams were for. A war boss was already naming himself with a hammer twice his size, and level by level the world became a drumbeat. In the corridors of the orbital tether, maintenance crews watched a blur of white cape pass with a sudden pressure that made their knees loosen. Picked lenses caught a smiling, bald man moving faster than the lenses could think, and everywhere he paused the air smelled like ozone and old wool. Everywhere he paused he asked for directions that made no sense to men whose entire lives were plotted in straight lines down and up. Captain Val had the bridge again and ordered the defense grid to arm, only to be answered by a governor who would not fire on his own hive. She called him naive in private and righteous in public. Then she put her ship between the tether and the thicker clouds of falling spores, because she knew what captains are for. Malchior watched 3 feeds at once. He saw Saitama on a roof edge looking down into Meridiana's canyon streets. He saw the first PDF line break without shame, because there is no shame in being human inside the mouth of green hunger. He saw the shrine cameras filling with faces wet with soot and hope as a yellow cape slipped by like something the Emperor might have remembered to send if he had remembered to send anything at all. And the Inquisitor made a new column in his ledger, 4, a civic event on the scale of a prophet regardless of origin. The Mechanicus aboard Oath of Relentless Light fought each other with quiet Bin Harik for ownership of the anomaly. An Archmagos named Alectrion 9 made a series of elegant claims about Archotech and lost human branches, and the experimental beauty of a force-to-energy efficiency that left no waste. Malchior let him speak until he was finished, and then said that all beauty is treason if it forgets who it serves. In the echoing minutes that followed, Saitama reached the skin of the hive, the place where Meridiana's arteries opened into a throat of cables and windows and prayer flags black with soot, and the city exhaled in relief. It did not know it had been holding as the stranger touched ferrocrete, with the softness of someone stepping into a neighbor's garden. The first orcs to sight him argued about whether he was a weird boy with his magic on the outside or a snack. Both opinions died of natural causes. Natural for them, unnatural for law. A single picked snare caught the thing that followed with good framing and better luck. A fist that moved without moving. A body that did not tense before the world did. A gesture so casual it bordered on impolite, and the warboss's chest became a red idea that forgot to exist. The tunnel of absence behind him bored through 6th deck, east and into the memory of anyone who believed matter was reliable. Malchior did not blink. He said to no one, to everyone, "You do not write a writ of execution for lightning," and then out loud to Val, "Hold planet kill options in reserve and scrub them from the governor's sight. Tell your gunners to pray to be redundant. Tell your psychers to stop naming this in their own blood before it starts naming them. Inform the arbitres that riots of adoration are still riots." In the hives below, a legend began with the unhelpful speed of fire in dry ribbon. A medallion maker sketched a bald saint with a circle of light, and a child lost her rations so she could buy it. A worker platoon forgot to sing the evening hymn and sang instead the kind of chant you invent when your throat is finally allowed to be loud. Somewhere in the depth where the poor believe coins turn into mercy if you polish them, a heretic wrote in a small, neat hand that perhaps the emperor's hand had returned wearing a different glove. On the tether deck, where the void had tried to speak earlier, Malchior stood alone and watched a yellow blur leave contrails of impossible arithmetic through the dust motes. Every lesson he had learned about power told him to bring a blade. Every lesson he had learned about survival told him to bring a leash. And somewhere underneath those lessons, something older and unpleasant told him that he was already too late to do either. He pressed a vox bead that belonged to no one but him and said into the private dark between syllables, "Record everything, sanctify nothing. The story will try to write itself. We will decide what sentences survive." And far below the world that had not been granted a miracle in 16 generations leaned forward in its chains, listening for a new sound in the thunder. The first miracle curdled into rumor before the smoke settled, and rumor into doctrine before the bodies were counted. Picked slates traded for a look at the hole carved through 6 decks, and through the faith of a city that had learned to worship difficulty. Old men in dormitories put their last chit on a tin charm stamped with a bald head and a circle of light. Arbeits patrols broke 3 small riots of adoration, where workers knelt in the middle of traffic lanes to touch a scrap of white cloth someone swore had brushed his cape. And above it all, the governor's council chamber, filled with the sound of important people trying to speak quietly and failing. The cardinal wanted the miracle named and filed inside a sermon. The Mechanicus envoy wanted it numbered and opened like a machine. The Lord Marshal wanted it pointed toward the problem that still had teeth, and Inquisitor Severin Malchior wanted it to stop being a surprise. He stood at the edge of the hololithic table while Meridiana Secundus showed him its wounds in cool green lines and said almost politely that the saint was not a saint until the throne said so, and that the throne did not speak in this room. Then he asked the Sensorium choir to replay the hangar records again and again until the pattern of absence became its own presence. No warp signature, no inertia cost, no thermal bloom. The data resisted adjectives like a man resists a second confession. He filed that resistance under unhelpful and began to build a trap made of observation and patience. Captain Leora Val kept her ship where a captain keeps it when a world wants to die, in the place where dying is delayed by the width of armor and the stubbornness of orders. Her gunners burned spore clusters when the atmosphere was clear enough to pretend that was easy. Her astropaths prayed in clean voices that cracked at the edges whenever the choir below sang a new name for a man who did not belong to their book. She watched Saitama on the external picked feeds as he walked the mid-hive like a tourist without a camera, stopping to lift a transit crawler so a child could retrieve a toy from a storm drain, pinching shut a leaking fuel line between 2 fingers and asking if anyone had coffee, which led to 100 kitchens trying to make a drink that matched a word from another sky. He ate without ceremony and complimented bread as if it were art, then stepped between a gang and their idea of taxation and diffused it by looking confused until everyone felt foolish. And everywhere he went, armsmen shadowed him at Malchior's quiet command, not to intervene, only to catalogue the impossible. The first proper reply from the other side did not come as a counter-argument. It came as pressure in the ears and the cold taste of copper on the tongue. The warp noticed the way only the warp can notice, by imitating desire until the veil thinned like a scab worried by a child. It began in a shrine 200 levels down, where a lay sister had told frightened men that the Emperor sends what is needed when it is needed, and pointed to a cheap icon of a bald man to prove it. The air rippled, the candles burned sideways, the statue of the god Emperor wept, and the tears ran upward. A line cracked across the far wall, and colors that do not belong in stone bled out into the room. The first daemon was only a taste, a bloodletter with a blade that had been drinking for 10,000 years. It stepped into the real with obvious pleasure and began to cut reality into more of itself. The Arbite's shotgun volley turned into steam against skin that did not admit to being made. Litany thrice repeated failed to bind. Sinners died in expensive and simple clothes, and then the room filled with a man in a yellow suit who said hey to the thing and asked it to stop. It swung the sword and discovered that swords and fingers have an old argument about which defines edge, and that this time fingers would win. Saitama caught the blade between thumb and forefinger, considered the weight like a cook testing a knife, flicked, and sent the daemon back into mathematics, which is where some monsters go when physics refuses them. Picked feeds of that exchange traveled faster than orders. The ecclesiarchy doubled its volume and halved its certainty. Some priests called him an instrument, while others called him a temptation shaped like hope. The Mechanicus chanted in 2 tongues at once and proposed that if a phenomenon can touch a thing, it can be measured by it. And Archmagos Alectryon 9 produced a crate of things that measure, null cages nested inside, stasis rings wrapped in hexagrammic wards that had held screaming alien intellects for entire lifetimes. Malchior allowed the attempt because he was not in the habit of refusing free lessons. They dropped the cage around Saitama in a cargo cavern and watched field strength climb to numbers that should have made gods cough, and then watched the man inside reach out and flatten a ward sigil against its own surface, as if patting dust from a coat. The energies bled away like embarrassment, and the Archmagos made a hungry sound that only a machine should make. Saitama apologized for touching the art and asked if the cage was important. Alectryon replied that it was interesting rather than important, and tried to hide the grief of a failed experiment behind ritual. On level 214, the orcs discovered what it is to inherit an uprising after your king has been turned into a hole. They fought one another in the absence of direction, and then slunk into the cracks where light forgets to follow. The PDF pushed forward for the first time in days and found abandoned trophies and a room full of teeth arranged into a crude crown. A commissar raised it like a chalice and declared victory to men who needed to believe the word. While above them, Governor Halix Rodal recalculated the cost of survival with a thumb that would not stop shaking, and found that the column marked tithe had become a joke with a skull carved into it. Malchior stood at his shoulder and did not pretend to share the man's grief. He was grateful for any arithmetic that pushed him nearer to clean authority. He sent a message to a small ship that did not advertise its temple, and told an operative whose name had been burned from her cradle to be patient. He said, "Watch the anomaly and the ones who gather to it, and never let your I am be ruled by adoration." And far from the council chamber, a woman in cameleo line adjusted the angle of a long rifle that belonged to a museum and said yes without voice. The warp is a copyist without shame, and soon it tried again, bigger, meaner, more sure of itself. The wound opened in a transit cathedral where the rails sang pilgrim songs and the roof hung like a promise above 20,000 commuters. This time it was not a single blade in a red hand. This time the air became a burning sermon about rage, and a thing too large for the room insisted that skulls are the only punctuation that matters. Its axe found a track and turned it into sparks that fell upward. The world tilted around a roar that bruised the lungs of the living, and Saitama walked up the side of a column because straight lines are for people who care about gravity, and told the greater thing to go home. It threw the axe and learned that weapon and will do not matter when the target is unconcerned by either. He pinched the cutting edge as if testing fabric in a market, and the haft shattered because the idea of pressure has rules, and he was not listening. The daemon laughed, because laughing is a way to buy time while you decide not to believe what you are seeing. Then it tried a different grammar, and tore at the place where men keep names. Psychers screamed across 4 blocks as the suggestion of unmaking brushed their minds. Saitama blinked at the wave and looked slightly offended. He said, "Serious punch," with the tone of a man choosing a larger spoon, and put his fist through the sermon and the pulpit, and the live agroting. Idea that the room had ever been a room. The wound in the world sealed like a mouth biting down on a secret. The daemon unraveled into a trail of hot dust that could not remember being anything else, and the choir of Meridiana exhaled in a single voice that called him saint, and then choked on the fear that follows words like that. Malchior watched the second banishment from 6 angles, and did not pretend that it pleased him. It clarified, which is more useful than pleasure. He saw a vulnerability that was not physical. He could be steered by crisis. He would go where the pain went. You could write a list of levers on a man like that. Civilians in danger, children in view, the rumor of a monster with a proper name, an invitation written as a threat. The Inquisitor did not smile because smiling wastes muscle. He simply began to place pieces in places where the board did not look like a board to anyone else. He instructed the Arbites to hold their lines thinner around food convoys and let the rumor of a raid reach the right ears. He asked Val to keep her gunners quiet in one orbital lane and loud in another to paint his map of attention. He told Alectrian to keep building kinder boxes that failed in interesting ways, because failure is a teacher that does not charge tithe. And he wrote a quiet letter on an encrypted slate to a brother captain who hunted nightmares as vocation, and told him to travel without badge and listen to the planet breathe. Saitama did not read any of those plans. He sat on the edge of a roof with a girl who should have left the city years ago, and never had the money to turn that sentence into a train ticket. She called herself Risa because that sounded like a person rather than a unit. She asked if heroes on his Earth got paid, and he said sometimes, but mostly it was vouchers and awkward applause. She asked if he missed anything besides good coffee, and he said his apartment, and his market, and his friend who lectured him about coupons. She told him there was a noodle stall in the mid-stacks that pretended it remembered what noodles were. He went with her and bought 4 bowls and said they tasted like honesty, which made the cook cry and claim a blessing he had not asked for. Afterward, they walked past a poster factory that had already pivoted to printing his face under the aquila, and he looked embarrassed while Risa laughed until she remembered that laughing without permission is dangerous. And then the night shook with a new siren that only the defense grid sings. Outside Meridiana Secundus, the void changed color. Ospec's ghosts walked across Captain Val's screens in shapes she did not like, not chaos, not orc, not the jagged silence that means Necron mathematics. This was a biology that travels like a storm front and eats like a religion, 3 small bioforms on the edge of range, and a heavier mind behind them that turned picked feed snow into hunger. The cogitators argued about classification until the old files on Behemoth and Kraken and Leviathan unrolled themselves like dead flags and lay across the consoles. Val did not say the word yet. She only told her crew to double checks on macro batteries and to light every off. Gur candle. In the council chamber, the Lord Marshal swallowed the taste of old stories, and the governor felt the floor rise under him, as if the planet had decided to meet its eater halfway. Melchior let the hint of the great devourer hang in the air and watched what it did to everyone's posture. Then he closed his hand over the moment like a miser over a coin and said, "We prepare, we watch. We do not pray for a miracle we have not earned." And in the transit cathedral, where the rails still sang and dust still fell like confession, workers swept up the last of a vanished sermon, while a bald man looked at the torn sleeve of his suit with mild regret and said, "It will be hard to find a tailor here." Risa said her aunt could sew if he did not mind uneven stitches. He said he did not. The city took another breath it had not known was waiting, and above the clouds space filled with the quiet ticking of something enormous, making up its mind, which door to knock on first. Which is how Meridiana Secundus ended its second day of believing in a new thing and began its third with its eyes open toward the dark. The morning broke with a color the planet had never seen before, a faint gold bleeding through the ash haze like light trying to remember what it used to mean. The streets of Meridiana Secundus were heavy with smoke and rumor. The prayers that had started as whispers now rolled through the hive like weather. Saint of the One Punch, they called him. Emperor's Fist, Divine Bald One. Their mouths could not agree, but their hearts had already chosen. The orcs had vanished into the underhive, leaving only echoes and broken glyphs. The manufactorums had fallen silent, because even the most hardened workers wanted to wait and see if the next miracle would arrive on schedule. And above all of it, Inquisitor Severin Melchior watched the shift in the city's rhythm, like a physician listening to a sick child's breathing. Too fast, too deep, unsustainable. Miracles are expensive, and he knew the bill always comes later. His office was a vault built into the tether spine. Walls carved with binding sigils, shelves lined with relics that hummed with memory. He spoke into a vox that reached only one man, Archmagos Electrion 9, and said the words that open investigations and close worlds. Begin comprehensive observation of subject Saitama. Complete spectrum. Organic, psychic, metaphysical. Treat the anomaly as specimen until I say otherwise. The Magos replied with a low chord of agreement, and already the forges below began to breathe faster. And outside the hive towers, the void was beginning to move in ways that made augurs nervous. The sensorium crews reported gravitational murmurs and biosignatures blooming like mold across the edges of the system, 3 of them large enough to cast reflections on the moon. And Captain Leora Val knew before her bridge crew said it aloud that it was the Great Devourer, not a myth but an arithmetic certainty. She ordered the batteries warmed and the defense grid sanctified, and sent a coded report to the governor's palace that began with the words, "Prepare your dead," down below. Saitama sat on the edge of a water tank high above the mid-hive, his cape drifting in the chemical breeze. Risa beside him holding 2 cups of something that smelled like oil and sugar, pretending it was coffee. She asked him again if he missed home, and he said, "Sometimes, but then again the sky here is interesting." She told him that most people born under this sky never see the sun. He said that seemed unfair. She laughed because fairness was not a word that survived long here. Far beneath them, in the data cathedra of the Mechanicus, the Archmagos was dissecting the impossible through equations that trembled with excitement. Each scan of Saitama's energy signature returned the same paradox. Infinite output, zero input, efficiency that defied conservation. A machine spirit wept binary hymns and shorted its own circuits in adoration. The Magos replaced it without emotion and concluded that the human body was a container more blasphemous than any Xenos relic. He sent the report to Melchior, who read it without expression and burned the original because data that powerful is a contagion, not knowledge. In the governor's palace, panic had become protocol. Meetings piled over meetings, each louder and less useful. The cardinal declared that the tyrannid approach was punishment for idolatry, and the Lord Marshal suggested that perhaps the saint might smite the swarm. Melchior listened without interest until the governor asked him directly whether the anomaly could defend the planet, and the Inquisitor's answer was as cold as void steel, perhaps, But if he can, it means the Emperor no longer needs us. The room fell silent because they all understood what that meant. Belief that no longer requires obedience is heresy. While they argued, the first dropships carrying survivors from the lower hives arrived at the upper platforms, their hulls streaked with ichor and dust. The people inside, pale from darkness and awe, they spoke of the man who had torn the Green Plague apart. They carried bits of cloth touched by him and pressed them to wounds that closed out of sheer conviction. The priests who tried to stop them were shoved aside by hands that no longer shook. Faith had found a new shape, and it did not wear gold. When night returned, it brought a red horizon, not sunset but burning atmosphere. The leading tendrils of the Tyrannid vanguard entered orbit, spore clouds larger than mountains spreading across the upper sky. The void shields screamed as they caught the first barrage of bioplasma, and inside the tether tower, Saitama stood beside Malchior, watching the feed. The Inquisitor spoke with the composure of a man who has practiced calm for 40 years. These are the great devourers of the hunger that eats hunger. They will strip this world to sand and silence. The fleets will not arrive in time. You understand the gravity of this? Saitama nodded and said, "So they're strong." The Inquisitor blinked. "Strength is not the word. This is extinction made flesh." Saitama tilted his head. "Then I should probably go handle it before it gets worse." Malchior opened his mouth to forbid him, but the air folded with a sigh. The man in yellow was gone, and a moment later the outer picked screens caught a streak of light leaving the atmosphere, a human Shar, ape moving faster than weapons can imagine. The battle that followed lasted less than an hour, and longer than history could comprehend. The first hive ship was the size of a small continent, a living continent that breathed acid and exhaled murder. It opened its maw to swallow the planet's orbiting stations and found something already inside its throat. A figure punching through layers of organic armor like paper. The explosion bloomed blue and white, a new sun that burned without malice. And then another ship died, and another, and each death painted the void with color no mortal eye could interpret. The swarm mind reacted, adapted, split its consciousness into fractals of strategy, but every new idea died before it could bloom because the intruder was faster than thought, faster than hunger, faster than God. The fleets of the Imperium watched through broken auspex and began to weep because they were witnessing the kind of victory that kills purpose. When the last hive ship disintegrated into dust, the void fell silent. No echoes, no radiation. Only a single man floating amid a debris field that would one day form a ring around the planet. He looked down through the thin blue haze of atmosphere and said quietly that was a workout. When he returned to the tether, the soldiers knelt, the tech priests chanted. Even the Inquisitor paused before speaking. "You have saved billions." The hero looked puzzled. "I just stopped some bugs. They were annoying." And then he yawned. Malchior turned away before his composure cracked. Behind his eyes, equations of faith and control broke apart. Like a glass, he knew what would come next. No creed survives a living miracle. No empire survives proof that it is unnecessary. He whispered to Captain Val to prepare containment contingencies under the name Saint Protocol. He told the Archmagos to prepare samples if the opportunity arose. And he told himself that if the Emperor truly worked through this man, then the Emperor had chosen a terrible messenger, one that spoke only in truth and simplicity, the most dangerous languages of all. That night the world celebrated, fires and hymns climbed together, children waved makeshift flags of yellow cloth. The people believed the war was over, and in a quiet corner of the hive, Risa sat beside Saitama on a cracked balcony watching the lights. She told him they were fireworks. He said they looked like people trying to talk to the stars. She asked if he would stay, and he said, "Maybe for a while. There are still monsters somewhere. There always are." And below them the city dreamed of peace, while the warp stirred restlessly, angry at being ignored. And Inquisitor Malchior wrote in his private log that salvation is a kind of weapon and that the Imperium must decide soon whether to worship it or destroy it. Night fell heavy across Meridiana Secundus, but it was not the kind of night that brings rest. It was the stillness of a world holding its breath after screaming for too long. The hive lights burned like fever under a sky that still glowed faintly from the burning carcasses of Tyranid vessels. The debris drifted like frozen ash, each piece the size of a city block, slowly falling toward the upper atmosphere. The air itself carried a metallic taste that made the tongue remember blood, and in the silence that followed annihilation, the people began to sing again because they did not know what else to do. They sang of the bald saint, of the man who punched the sky and made it bleed victory, of the savior who asked for nothing. And this time the song reached the spires of the governor's palace, where candles melted, untouched, and guards pretended not to kneel when no one was looking. Inquisitor Severin Malchior did not sleep. He sat in his quarters surrounded by the low hum of machine spirits and the steady rhythm of data streams crawling across his vision. Every report, every image, every word spoken about the anomaly was catalogued in perfect order. His notes were not praise or condemnation, but anatomy. He was dissecting belief itself, tracing its arteries through the hive like a disease. He understood now that what terrified him most was not the man's strength, but the infection of hope that followed it. Hope without structure, without permission, unregulated, unlicensed faith. It would corrode everything it already had. The cults were growing faster than any Arbite's decree could contain them. The ecclesiarchy issued proclamations against unauthorized worship, but their own priests quoted Saitama in sermons, calling him the emperor's reminder to remain humble, and the people nodded and listened, because for the first time in memory, humility had a face that smiled. Captain Leoraval tried to restore discipline aboard the Oath of Relentless Light, but her crew had been witness to the impossible, and men who have seen a god bleed or laugh never quite return to obedience. The gunners painted a small yellow circle on their macro cannon barrels. The sensorium, adepts left offerings of ration bars and hand-drawn portraits near the observation deck, where he had returned from the void. She did not stop them. She simply walked the bridge with her hands clasped behind her back, repeating the same order each hour. Maintain readiness. The void is patient. It always comes back hungry. Saitama, meanwhile, moved through the mid-hive like an ordinary traveler, his yellow suit stained with smoke and dirt, his cape torn and stitched clumsily by Risa's aunt. He carried a small satchel that contained nothing of value. Sometimes he helped workers lift wreckage or carry supplies. Sometimes he ate noodles in silence, while children argued over who would get to sit closest to him. He rarely spoke of what had happened in orbit. When people asked, he only said it was fine now. The problem was solved, and if they pushed, he smiled a little and asked if anyone knew where to find decent coffee. They never did, but they offered whatever they had, and he accepted, grateful and bored in the same breath. In the underhive, something older than faith was waking. The warp did not forget insults, and the destruction of the daemon in the transit cathedral had left a wound in its echo. The creatures that dwell in thought and hate gathered around that scar like sharks around blood. They whispered to mortals who dreamed too loud. They promised meaning to those who could not accept simplicity. One of them found its vessel in a cardinal who had lost his authority when the people stopped attending his masses. The thing crawled behind his eyes and whispered that divinity unused is divinity wasted, that the emperor's silence was permission. And the man nodded until his bones clicked. He began to write sermons that twisted scripture into prophecy. He said that the saint had not come from the emperor but from beyond him, that he was proof that the Imperium had been forsaken. His words spread through the dark, like light from a corrupted star. And soon people were gathering not in churches but in tunnels, chanting not prayers but possibilities. Malchior's informants brought him fragments of these gatherings, and he read them with a cold detachment that frightened even himself. Heresy evolves faster than plague, he wrote in his ledger, and sometimes it wears a smile. Archmagos Electrian 9 was not idle either. In his forge deep beneath the tether he had taken residue collected from the hull of a destroyed hive ship and samples from the air where Saitama's blows had distorted reality. He studied them with reverence and terror. The readings were impossible. The atomic lattice of the residue carried echoes of physical laws rewritten. He concluded that each punch did not simply release energy but briefly redefined the universe around it. He recorded this in a sealed file labeled God Physics and sent a single line of summary to Melchior. The anomaly is rewriting the equations of creation. The Inquisitor read it twice, then deleted it, and told the Magos to destroy his instruments and take confession from a tech priest before returning to work. They both understood this meant build more instruments. Above them, the planetary defenses still tracked the debris field, and on the outer edges of the system, new signals appeared. Not tyrannid this time, but something colder, a mechanical silence older than humanity. The augur priests whispered the word Necron before Melchior could forbid it. He watched the traces for hours before deciding they were not yet a threat. The Imperium always has room for one more apocalypse, but not today. Saitama's days became simple again. He helped rebuild broken districts. He repaired power lines without understanding how they worked. He once pulled an entire tram out of a crater so the workers could resume transport. They called him Saint, Savior, Protector. He told them he was just helping out, and each denial made them believe more deeply. He did not realize that his humility was being translated into gospel. Risa followed him everywhere with a notebook where she wrote everything he said. She had decided someone should remember correctly. Before the stories twisted completely, she noticed that he looked lonelier each day. She asked if he ever got tired of saving everyone, and he said not tired exactly. It just stops feeling like anything. She didn't understand, but she smiled anyway. Far above the hive in a silent chamber of the tether, Melchior met with his peers through hollow projection, representatives of the Ordo Xenos, Ordo Hereticus, and one from the Ordo Malleus, whose armor glowed faintly from wards that never ept. They debated the anomaly for 7 hours, each word a weapon, each sentence a potential execution. The Hereticus woman said the saint must be destroyed before he becomes legend. The Xenos Lord said he must be studied until we can replicate him. The Malleus Knight said he must be contained for the safety of reality itself. And Melchior said quietly that all three are the same act, described by different fears. They asked if he could control the subject, and he said not yet. They asked if the subject was human, and he said, perhaps more than we are. And when the council ended, he deactivated the holo links and sat alone staring at his hands, wondering when exactly he had stopped believing in the Emperor's plan and started trying to write one of his own. The next morning, Meridiana Secundus woke to an earthquake that was not an earthquake, but a vibration through space itself. The sky flickered between blue and crimson. The clouds bent into spirals that did not belong to any weather system, and the psychers in the choir screamed in unison. A warp storm was forming above the planet, a storm without source. It was as if the warp itself was focusing on this one world, the one man who had humiliated it. The storm opened like an eye, and from it poured shapes that mocked the laws of life. Daemons of every legion, every color, every impossible origin. They fell in silence and landed in fire, and the people who had learned to sing began to pray again, not for salvation, but for the return of their impossible protector. The defense forces opened fire, and their lasguns burned holes in airbu, done not in flesh. The hive was turning into a grave. And somewhere in the middle levels, Saitama stopped mid-conversation, tilted his head, and sighed. He told Risa to go hide. She said she wasn't going anywhere. He smiled at that. Then he looked up toward the trembling ceiling, cracked his knuckles, and said, "Guess I'll go punch the sky again." Melchior watched the storm open through his hololith and felt the old cold of helplessness creeping through his bones. For all his planning and all his schemes, he was still just a man watching gods argue. He whispered to no one that if the Emperor still sees this world, then he will either send help or let it burn. And far above them, the warp storm bled into the upper atmosphere, its light spilling through the clouds in colors that burned the eyes. And a single bright line rose from the hive into that chaos. A yellow comet cutting through the heart of the storm. The picked feeds captured it only for seconds before the radiation blinded them all. And the last thing they saw before the signal died was the silhouette of a man facing the darkness, as if it were just another chore to finish before dinner. And then the storm screamed. The storm screamed with a voice made of every soul it had ever swallowed. It tore across the sky and turned night into a bruise. Buildings shook and glass became dust. The Vox networks drowned in static that carried fragments of prayers and orders that no longer had meaning. Inside the warp's mouth, daemons howled as they pushed into reality, shapes half-formed, their bodies a collage of hunger and memory. They fell burning angels into the hives below, their claws carving through ferrocrete like wet clay, each impact birthing fire that moved as if it had a will of its own. The air itself seemed alive with malice and disbelief. And amid that chaos, a single figure rose higher, a streak of light against the storm. Saitama punched through the lower clouds without effort, his cape whipping behind him like a forgotten banner. The wind around him froze. Lightning struck him twice and dissolved into nothing. The noise of the world dimmed as he pierced the upper atmosphere and entered the heart of the storm. What he saw there could have broken mortal reason. Oceans of crimson fire turning inward on themselves, rivers of faces screaming in reverse. Colossal daemons made of thought and rage, each the size of cities, orbiting a wound in the fabric of reality. And inside that wound a throne of twisting bone and shadow, where a greater presence watched him with eyes that belonged to too many creatures to count. Its voice rolled through space without sound. "You are a mistake in creation," it said. "Your existence is an insult to the balance of despair. You break what must never be broken." Saitama blinked, tilting his head slightly. "You talk too much." The thing rose from its throne. Its wings of glass spread across the storm. Entire fleets could have sailed on its back. It was the architect of this invasion, a greater daemon lord of all four powers, its form changing with every blink. Now claw, now halo, now flame. "I am the voice of ruin," it said, "the hand that feeds on hope. You are not welcome here." Saitama floated closer, not even impressed. "Well, too bad, because I already live here now." And then it attacked. The storm itself turned into a weapon, tendrils of molten ether wrapped around him. The sky folded. The hive below became a distant memory. In the governor's palace, alarms howled as the structure trembled. Inquisitor Malchior clung to the hololith rail and watched a god of corruption fighting a man with bare fists. The feed shook. The Magos shouted that the energy readings surpassed any known stellar output. The planet's core was vibrating in sympathy. If it continued, the crust would shatter. Captain Val screamed for the orbital stations to divert power to the void shields. They obeyed, but it was like trying to shield an ant from the sun. Above them, the sky detonated. Color ceased to obey light. The greater daemon struck with a storm of claws larger than mountain ranges. Saitama vanished in a blur and reappeared behind it, his fist glowing with the kind of simplicity that makes gods nervous. "Serious series, serious punch." He said it quietly, but the words vibrated through the warp itself. The blow connected with the demon's chest and everything froze. For one impossible instant, time forgot to exist. Then reality caught up. The explosion rippled outward in absolute silence. Cities on the surface saw the clouds part, and for the first time in centuries the real sun burned through. The daemon's body came apart layer by layer, its essence scattering like sand in a hurricane. The warp storm screamed again, but this time the sound was retreat. The portal above the plan, and it imploded, dragging the surviving lesser demons back into the nothing that had vomited them forth. And when the light faded, there was only one figure left, drifting above the torn sky. A man in a yellow suit, looking slightly annoyed, down below millions watched through shattered windows and half-dead pict screens as the storm closed and the first clean dawn broke across Meridiana Secundus. The victory was so vast that even the administratum did not know how to record it. The governor wept at his desk. The cardinal fell to his knees, shouting that the emperor had walked among them. The Magos whispered 1,000 equations to explain the unexplainable until his vox slit burned out, and Malchior stood alone in the chamber staring at the sun. He could not decide whether he had just witnessed salvation or the death of meaning. His vox crackled with reports of mass hysteria, entire districts turning into spontaneous parades, workers abandoning their posts to carve statues, arbites overwhelmed by pilgrims from other hives, everyone chanting the same name, the same promise. He understood then that the Imperium could not survive this kind of hope, not for long, so he summoned his assassin, a figure in black armor that shimmered like water, its neural ports humming softly. She knelt without a word. He told her to prepare, observe, and wait. When he gives you an opening, you end it. Not out of hate, but necessity. Humanity cannot worship something it understands. The assassin nodded once and vanished into the air. Saitama descended through the clouds back into the hive. The people saw on him and their cheers broke through the thunder. They reached for him as if his shadow could heal them. He tried to smile, but the noise was too much. Risa fought her way through the crowd until she reached him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "You did it," she said. "They're gone." He looked down at her. "I guess, but now, everyone's staring again." She laughed and told him to get used to it. He scratched his head. "I don't want to get used to it. I just want things quiet again." And somewhere behind him the assassin took aim, her rifle breathing softly as it calibrated the distance. Her finger tightened, and then she froze. A hand rested lightly on her shoulder. She turned and saw Malchior himself standing there, his face pale, his eyes locked on the man below. "Not yet," he whispered. The moment passed, the rifle lowered. The Inquisitor had realized something. Killing him now would make him eternal. Letting him live might make him forgotten. Days passed. The warp storm faded completely. The world began to rebuild under banners of yellow and white. Statues rose, sermons multiplied. A new cult took shape faster than any decree could suppress. The ecclesiarchy chose compromise, canonizing him unofficially as Saint Invictus of the Common Hand, claiming he was the Emperor's flesh, reborn for a single crusade. Malchior approved the decree, knowing it was a lie that would buy time. He needed the Imperium to absorb the miracle into bureaucracy before it consumed itself. So he invited Saitama to the palace under pretense of gratitude. The hero arrived wearing the same suit, cleaner now, saw beside him carrying a basket of gifts from the lower hive. They were ushered into the grand hall, where every light was too bright and every man wore too many medals. The governor bowed, the cardinal blessed. The Magos offered a small golden medallion humming with data. Saitama looked uncomfortable and said, "Thank you, but I really don't need anything." Malchior stepped forward. Smiling the way only professionals of deceit can smile, he said, "Your humility honors us. But you must understand what you have become. You are a symbol. The people believe the Emperor sent you. And symbols are dangerous if they walk freely." Saitama shrugged. "I'm just a guy who likes helping out." The Inquisitor's eyes flickered. "Then help us. Stay here. Guide the people. Lend your name to order. We will provide anything you need. Safety, food, comfort." Risa frowned, sensing the trap in his tone. Saitama shook his head. "I can't stay in one place. There's always something to fix somewhere else. Besides, I'm starting to miss my apartment." The words made Malchior blink. "Apartment," he repeated. "You wish to return home?" "Yeah." "My friend's probably worried," the Inquisitor exhaled, an idea forming like ice. "Perhaps that can be arranged. The Mechanicus have studied the energy that brought you here. Maybe it can be reversed." The Magos's eyes lit up. Yes, the breach energy remains measurable. It could be reopened. Saitama smiled faintly. Really? You can send me back? The Inquisitor nodded slowly. It will take time. But yes, I believe we can. And in that moment, he knew he had found the chain he needed. Hope of return. A tether strong enough to keep even a god compliant. That night, he wrote the final line of his report to Terra. It read, "The anomaly is contained by promise. The Emperor's will endures," and he sealed it with a prayer he no longer believed in. Outside the window, the hive lights shimmered, and in the streets below, the people lifted candles toward the sky, chanting the name of a man who could break the universe with one punch, yet still apologized when he did. The Imperium did not know whether to crown him or fear him, and in the shadows of the palace a plan began to grow that would decide which choice came first. The days that followed turned the hive into something unrecognizable. The air smelled not only of ash and oil, but of incense, the kind burned for saints. Banners of yellow cloth hung from the towers like veins of gold across the grey. Statues rose faster than logic could explain, carved by hands that should have been rebuilding walls but instead sculpted hope. The people worked with a kind of joy that frightened the officers sent to manage them. Every face glowed with belief and exhaustion, every mouth repeated the same name, Saitama, and the echoes of that name reached every level from the underhive to the spires. The sound became a pulse, a rhythm that replaced fear with something more dangerous, certainty, and in the governor's palace, the same certainty turned to dread. Inquisitor Malchior moved through the corridors like a shadow that had learned how to speak. He met with the cardinal whose eyes were bloodshot from prayer and politics. He told him the cult must be contained before it consumes the structure of faith. The cardinal said containment is no longer possible. Even the sermons of the high priests now end with his name. If the people find joy, they will not surrender it. The Inquisitor's answer was soft and cold. Then we must redirect it. Faith can be harvested like heat. It simply needs proper channels. He sent word to the ecclesiarchy to sanctify the saint of the One Punch as a servant of the Emperor, to rewrite him as an instrument of divine will, to make obedience flow through him rather than around him. It worked for a time. The crowds calmed, the heresy slow, wed. But the power of miracles cannot be owned by paperwork. The people saw Saitama walking their streets and believed in him, not in doctrine, not in decrees, in him, and that made him dangerous. Meanwhile, Archmagos Electrion IX turned his forge into a temple of heretical science. He had been ordered to study the dimensional remnants from the breach that brought the anomaly here. In his mind and his machine spirits obsessed with the idea of returning that power to the Imperium's control. He dissected the fragments of collapsed space-time around the orbit. He built diagrams that whispered in the voices of gods long dead. He dreamed of using the energy to create portals through which men could conquer not just galaxies but realities. And as his thoughts grew darker, he began to see patterns forming in the data. Threads that pulsed with familiarity, as if something on the other side of the breach was still watching. He recorded the readings in secret and labeled them Project Zenith. Malchior found the file within a day. He visited the forge alone and stood before the Magos surrounded by cables that glowed like veins and asked how far along he was. The Magos answered with pride, "I can open it again, I can reach where he came from, perhaps even summon another." The Inquisitor looked at him for a long moment and said softly, "The last thing the Imperium needs is another god." Then he raised his bolt pistol and fired once through the Magos' central eye. The body fell with a metallic groan. Malchior ordered the data sanctified and the forge sealed. He told the adepts that the Archmago had ascended to the Omnissiah's grace, and that the Omnissiah preferred silence. Saitama knew none of this. He spent his days helping and waiting. Every morning he visited the Mechanicus laboratories, asking if they had found a way home yet. Every evening he returned to the same balcony where he could see the ruined horizon. Risa joined him with a plate of bread or whatever counted as dinner. She told him stories about the hive's past, about her mother who had vanished into the lower levels, about a time when the sky was not so dark. He listened quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking away. She asked if he was happy, and he said happiness was a word that never stayed put. It moved too fast for him. She laughed and told him he talked like an old priest. He said maybe the priests were bored too. One morning the void alarm sounded again, but it was not invasion, it was arrival. Ships bearing the sigil of the Inquisition entered orbit, black hulls etched with scripture. Their presence was both promise and threat. Melchior had called them. The Council of the Ordos had finally responded to his reports. 3 inquisitors of equal rank, one from each branch, arrived with retinues of soldiers and psychers. The city trembled with their landing. Their banners made the air heavy. They were led into the palace and greeted with ceremony. Their voices filled the hall like knives scraping metal. They demanded to see the anomaly. They demanded to know why it still lived. Melchior defended his decision with logic that felt thin even to him. He said it was under control, that the Mechanicos was working on a solution, that elimination would create martyrdom. They listened in silence, then dismissed him from his own command. The Ordos were taking over. The hero was to be transferred to their custody for containment and study. They would decide his fate after dissection. Melchior nodded, bowed, and left the room without expression, but inside his mind he was already rewriting the end. That night he went to Saitama's quarters, where the hero sat with Risa watching the stormless sky. He told him quietly that others were coming, who did not see him as a friend. That if he wanted to go home, he had to come with him now. Saitama looked skeptical. "I thought you were the one who didn't trust me." The Inquisitor smiled faintly. "I don't, but I trust the alternatives even less." Risa asked where they were going. Melchior answered the Mechanicus complex, the one under seal. "It's the only place where the coordinates still exist. If we can reach the machine before they do, we might open a door." They left under darkness, moving through maintenance corridors guarded only by silence and the hum of ancient reactors. Above them, the Inquisition Council prepared their capture team, a detachment of Grey Knights led by a brother captain who had faced daemons and never lost. They advanced through the hive with prayers on their tongues and purity seals fluttering, convinced that their mission was holy. In the forge, Melchior broke the seals with his rosette and activated the dormant engines. The room lit up with sickly green light as the coils began to spin. The portal array hummed like a living thing awakening from a nightmare. Saitama looked at it and said, "So, that's my way home?" The Inquisitor nodded. "Maybe. It's a guess built on treason." Risa clutched his arm. She asked if it would hurt. He said, "Probably not. Just don't think too hard." They were interrupted by the arrival of the Grey Knights. The massive doors burst inward. A dozen armored giants entered with weapons drawn. The brother captain shouted by order of the Emperor, "Stand down. The anomaly is under our jurisdiction." Melchior stepped forward, his voice steady. "If you open fire, you'll destroy the array, and with it any chance of sealing the dimensional wound." The captain raised his blade. "We came to end a threat, not preserve it." He advanced, and in that moment, the first psychic discharge from their wards hit Saitama like a wall of cold flame. His cape snapped, his eyes narrowed. He said this again, more shouting, more fighting. He caught the blade in his hand as it came down. Sparks flew like stars. The Grey Knight tried to push, but the blade bent. Saitama sighed. "Sorry, but I really don't have time for this." He flicked his wrist, and the shockwave threw the entire squad against the walls, armor cracking like glass. None of them dead, just broken. Risa screamed as energy from the unstable portal began to ripple through the chamber. Melchior shouted for her to get clear. She refused. The Inquisitor turned to Saitama and yelled, "Now, step into it now." The machine reached critical mass, its center opening into a swirling void of white and gold. Saitama hesitated, looking back at the hive he had saved. At the girl clutching her notebook, at the man who had spent every day watching him like a weapon. He said, "Tell them to stop worshipping me." "I'm not what they think," Malchior answered. "I know. Go." The hero nodded once, stepped forward, and vanished into the light. The portal collapsed with a thunderclap that cracked the forge floor. The lights went out, and when they came back, the machine was gone. The walls were blackened, and Saitama was nowhere. Only a faint smell of ozone and dust remained. In the silence that followed, Risa fell to her knees, sobbing. Malchior stood behind her, exhausted. 1,000 words unsaid, dying in his throat. The grey knights rose slowly, their armor dented but functional. The brother captain looked at him with fury. "What have you done? You've doomed us all." The Inquisitor shook his head. "No, I've saved what's left of us." The captain pointed his blade, but Malchior raised his rosette. "I act in the Emperor's light. Do you want to argue theology now?" The knight hesitated, then turned away, calling for evacuation. As they left the forge, Risa whispered to Malchior through tears, "Do you think he made it?" The Inquisitor answered, not sure if he was talking to her or himself. "Maybe he never really left anywhere. Maybe he just goes where he's needed." The girl nodded as if that was enough. And above them, in the palace, the Ordos Council demanded answers. The Mechanicus screamed heresy. The Ecclesiarchy declared a new age of miracles, and the people below continued to light candles to a saint who was gone but not gone, the Emperor's will or something beyond it. It no longer mattered. Hope had a shape now, and it wore a yellow suit. And in the black between stars, something vast stirred. The remnants of a voice that once called itself Karak, whispering across the void, promising that the barrier between worlds had thinned, and somewhere, in a small apartment lit by morning sun, a bald man sat eating noodles, glancing at the sky, wondering if maybe today's monster attack would be interesting. The galaxy turned slowly as it always had, indifferent to victories or prayers, and yet something subtle had changed in the weave of it. Across thousands of worlds, whispers carried by astropathic networks spoke of the saint who had crossed the stars, the hero who had come from nowhere, the man who had silenced the great devourer and punched a hole through the heart of the warp. Most called it legend, some called it heresy, others called it prophecy. The Ecclesiarchy chose to canonize and contain in the same breath. They built new shrines filled with white marble and golden circles. They named them Sanctums of Invictus. Pilgrims gathered from across sectors, bringing offerings of bread and water, claiming that simple gifts were all their saint ever asked for. Priests recited new litanies that were half scripture and half rumor. Yet through it all, one rule was repeated. He was sent by the Emperor. He was of the Emperor, and his departure was his return to the Emperor. It was safer that way, to fold the unknown back into faith. The Administratum approved the doctrine, the heretic scribes rewrote history, and in 1,000 years the story would be as sacred as any crusade, because that is how the Imperium survives, by forgetting the truth and sanctifying the version that hurts less. Inquisitor Severin Malchior remained on Meridiana Secundus for 3 more months after the disappearance, long enough to clean the wreckage of the forge, long enough to send reports that were half lies and half confession. He buried Electrion 9's ashes in silence, ordered Risa placed under protective custody under the name Witness 001, and spent each night staring from the palace spire at the planet that had learned to smile again. Sometimes he envied the people below, their faith so loud it drowned out logic. Sometimes he hated them for it. He told himself he had done the right thing, that sending the anomaly away had saved humanity from itself. Yet each night the doubt came crawling back. If the Emperor had sent him, then perhaps the Imperium was wrong to fear him. But if he came from something beyond, something larger, then maybe all of this, every cathedral and sacrifice and crusade, was a lie. He recorded these thoughts in a private log sealed behind triple encryption, a journal that no one would ever read. In it he wrote that perhaps the greatest threat to the Imperium is not chaos or Xenos, but the possibility of a benevolent power that asks for nothing, a god who refuses worship, a hero who saves because it is right. Such a thing would break the machinery of control that holds mankind together. And so he ended the entry with the line, "Mercy must remain a myth, or we cease to deserve it." Captain Leora Val departed soon after with the oath of relentless light. She left behind half her crew, who refused to abandon the new shrine that had been built over the ruins of the forge. She did not stop them. In her report, she wrote that morale had become a religion and that discipline now wore a halo. Her last recorded words before translation into the warp were a toast to the man who had reminded her that duty is not always the same as faith. The ship was lost in the warp 2 weeks later, its final astropat. Hick's signal described a figure of light moving parallel to them in the darkness. No signature, no threat, only a quiet presence, keeping pace until the storm cleared. In the underhive, Risa lived in hiding. The Inquisition kept her under watch but allowed her to move freely. She wrote her memories of him in a notebook that would one day become a relic. She described how he laughed softly when people called him holy, how he complained about food, how he looked at the sky as if expecting it to apologize. She wrote that his power was not his strength but his kindness, that he could have ruled worlds, but chose instead to listen to a girl who had nothing. She never published the notes, but copies spread through the hive anyway, handwritten and smuggled in bread shipments. Soon entire districts were quoting her words as if they were holy text. The faith changed again. Smaller, quieter, stripped of grand titles. They stopped calling him saint and started calling him friend. Their prayers became simpler: protect us like you protected her, make us strong enough to smile, and the Inquisition debated whether to burn this new heresy, but Malchior vetoed it. He said, let them have their friend, there are worse idols than hope. Years passed and the scars of invasion healed. The manufactorums roared again. The hive breathed industry instead of incense. Yet somewhere deep beneath the surface in the catacombs, the Mechanicus kept one secret alive. The shattered remains of the portal array, the machine that had once bridged two realities, its coils dormant but not dead. Occasionally, it would pulse, with a faint shimmer of energy as though remembering something, a hum that matched no known frequency. Some said it was just residue, others said it was a heartbeat. The adepts assigned to guard it swore they heard footsteps sometimes, soft and rhythmic, like a man pacing patiently on the other side. Centuries later, the legend of Meridiana Secundus became a chapter of imperial folklore, a tale recited by soldiers before battle. Mothers told their children about the bald saint who defeated monsters by reminding them they were small. Priests used his story to teach humility and obedience, forgetting that he never asked for either, but sometimes the old texts resurfaced. Fragments of unedited truth written by hands too brave or too naive to censor. Those texts told of a man who arrived without armor or purpose, who looked at the galaxy's cruelty and did not despair, who stood before gods and refused to kneel, and in that defiance found something purer than faith, something the Imperium would never understand. Far away beyond the reach of the Astronomicon, in a universe that was smaller, kinder, and no less broken, a man awoke to the sound of rain on his apartment window, his bowl of noodles half-eaten, his television flickering between static and news reports about another monster attack downtown. He sighed, stretched, and stood, pulling on his yellow suit and cape, the same one he had worn in every world. He stepped onto the balcony and looked at the city below. The lights glowed, the air smelled clean, normal, almost boring. He smiled a little. Maybe it had all been a dream, a weird one, but he felt something heavy in his pocket. He reached in and pulled out a small medallion, tarnished but intact, the double-headed eagle of the Imperium faintly etched into its surface. He turned it over in his hand and stared at it for a long moment. The sky above him rumbled with distant thunder. He whispered to no one, "Wonder how they're doing over there." Then he put the medallion on the table beside his bowl, tightened his gloves, and leapt from the balcony. The wind roared past him, his cape snapped open. and for an instant he could almost hear the sound of chanting from another galaxy, voices raised not in fear but in faith, calling a name that belonged to no one and everyone, Saint of the One Punch, hero of humanity, the man who proved that even in the grim darkness of the far future, there could still exist a single act of kindness so powerful it split eternity. And as he soared over his own world, heading toward another meaningless fight, the universe itself seemed to smile, faintly, like a story that refuses to end. Somewhere in the endless dark between stars, a whisper lingered. Maybe he'll come back, maybe he already has. And the warp, remembering its defeat, stayed quiet for a while, as if even chaos needed to catch its breath.